Good morning, everybody. I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and doing well. A special hello to our alumni and friends living on the West Coast and in the areas of the South that are being affected by the horrific weather occurring there. Please all take care. My name is John Diamond. I'm the president and CEO of the Maine Alumni Association, and I'm glad you're able to join us today. Our audience includes Black Bears and friends from 22 states and the District of Columbia.
Cool.
So that's a wonderful turnout. Our presentation today features UMaine history professor Liam Riordan, who will be discussing how Maine became a state and what we can learn from this year's bicentennial celebration, in which he's very, very actively involved. Dr. Riordan's presentation will cover roughly half of our session today, which is an hour long in all, and then the second half will be saved for your questions and his answers. So if you'd like to submit a question, there's an easy way to do that. At the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen, you'll see a little cartoon-like speaking bubble. That's the chat bubble. A lot of us are used to that if you've been spending any time on Zoom. If you want to submit a question, just click on that bubble, type in your question, and hit the return or enter key on your keyboard. And we will get to as many questions as possible during the time we have available to us. And just so you know, we're recording this session, so if you want to go back and watch it later, you may do so, or if you want to let other people know about the video and its availability, they'll be able to access that through the umainealumni.com website under activities and events there. We'll send you out some information following this in the later on to help you remember that. So let's get started if we can. First, let me give you a little bit of background about Dr. Riordan. Liam Riordan joined the UMaine faculty in 1997, and he currently holds the title of Adelaide and Allen Bird Professor of History. That's a prestigious endowed professorship at the University of Maine. Dr. Riordan received his undergraduate degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and his doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania. He also, in 2012, was a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. His academic expertise includes, but isn't limited to, the American Revolution, and it involves the period during which Maine sought to achieve statehood.
Commemorate.
He has received awards on and off campus for his scholarly work, one of which was the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Outstanding Faculty Member Award for Service and Outreach. From 2014 to 2016, Dr. Riordan served as the director of UMaine's McGillicuddy Humanities Center. He's also the past board member of the Maine Humanities Council, which is the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He's active in National History Day in Maine, which is part of a national research program involving students in grades 6 through 12. So very impressive, one of UMaine's many impressive faculty members, and we're so pleased to welcome him today. And thank you, Dr. Riordan, for your willingness to offer this presentation. It's all yours.
All right. Well, thanks, John, for the opportunity to speak with the Alumni Association, and thanks to all the support staff who helped us get connected and helped me figure out better ways to share my screen, particularly to Aisha Ver. So as John mentioned, over the last several years, I have begun looking into the history of Maine's statehood era that stretches from the 1780s to the 1820s. And I look forward to sharing some of that with you in the next half hour or so. But before I turn to that historical subject, I think it's worthwhile to start with a broader question about how we commemorate the past and what sort of significance a 200-year marker like a bicentennial possesses. And so I've got up on my screen the commemorative license plate that's been issued by the state of Maine. For those of you still living in Maine, this is a fairly recognizable symbol of the bicentennial in Maine today, maybe the most recognizable aspect of the bicentennial in Maine popular culture. But the question that it frames with those dates, 1820 on one side and 2020 on the other, is, I think, a really interesting one. How do those resonate with one another? Do they have any meaningful connection across the course of 2 centuries? Right? So a bicentennial is kind of a funny thing, right? We have 10 fingers, so we count by decades and we count by centuries, but the mere fact of that 200 number itself doesn't really have any significance or meaning. So the question I want to start with is simply, what might a bicentennial help us to do? You know, do we have a goal in mind when we practice historical commemoration? How do we and how should we remember the relatively distant past? And history, of course, serves any number of functions. It can entertain, it can inform, it can instruct. But I think at its very best, historical understanding helps us to grasp deeper meanings about our society, about our culture, and even about our sense of self. So I think that history has the potential for us to expand our gaze beyond our individual present moment and to make connections more broadly and to recognize what we share as a community. So that's a kind of lofty way of framing the talk, but I hope that maybe we can come back at the end in the question and discussion section and talk a bit about how does our sense of the distant past lead us to reflect about our contemporary circumstances in different sorts of ways. So let me turn to the historical subject proper with a statement just about the basic facts of statehood. So Maine became the 23rd state in the US on March 15th, 1820. So we have a very specific, formal, official birthday for the state, which more or less coincided with the start of COVID shutdown. So that's certainly a bicentennial marker that will be hard to forget. And that creation of Maine as an independent state ended a very long relationship that Maine had had with Massachusetts, right? Starting in the 1650s, the District of Maine, or Down East Maine, the eastern part of Massachusetts, all of these were sort of how Maine was described, but it was part of the Massachusetts colony and then the Commonwealth of Massachusetts until 1820. So a long, deep interconnection that was not severed easily in 1820. And so we have a tendency to just focus in on this end date and think about that 1820-2020 connection. But part of what interests me is how long it took us to get to this breaking point. So as I mentioned before, I think of the quote unquote statehood era as really stretching from the 1780s, when the earliest proposals for the District of Maine to separate from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts were floated. And it was a long, difficult struggle to get to this final breaking point where Maine became independent on that date. So my talk today is really structured around 4 past-present connections, 4 aspects of the statehood era that were significant for how Maine became a state. And those same issues from the early 19th century, I think we can still recognize as quite influential and present in contemporary Maine and US society. So this is part of my argument really about what historical commemoration can do for us. Not just entertain and not just teach, but also help us to be more reflective about who we are as individuals and who we are as a society in the 21st century. Not just ground in our contemporary moment, not just looking to the future, but also aware of long historical legacies and continuities that connect us with the relatively distant past. So the first of the 4 past-present connections I'm going to talk about, and this one I talk about at a little greater length than some of the others, is the most famous aspect of how and when Maine became a state, right? So there's one famous, widely recognized, historically significant aspect of Maine's statehood process. And it's also an aspect of Maine becoming a state that is a little confusing. And I have to say, I did not really understand the complete contours of it until relatively recently, as I began to really try to figure out how should we think about Maine in our bicentennial moment. So the first of my 4 past-present connections is this confusing issue of how is Maine somehow related to slavery in this period of statehood, really the very end of this statehood process from 1819 to 1821. And what I've got up on the screen now is sort of a classic map that is more or less some version of this in every single US history textbook that's been published in the 20th century. Right? And it is titled the Missouri Compromise, and it refers to this resolution of an incredibly explosive moment in national political culture that begins in 1819 and is not really resolved for 2 or 3 years. And essentially, national politics has ground to a halt over the question, should Missouri be admitted to the Union with slavery as a legal institution? So there's one continuity, deadlock in Washington, D.C., a lot of partisan anger. I mean, this was an intense disagreement that I would say exceeds the kind of partisan rancor we see in our contemporary political world, which is certainly saying something. So when I first gave a talk like this, one of the very first comments I got from the audience was a person who put up their hand and she said, you know, when I went to high school in Maine, we learned about this as a different sort of event. And I'm really annoyed that this textbook map is calling this the Missouri Compromise. Shouldn't it be the Maine Missouri Compromise? And I said, oh, well, yeah, you're right. That is kind of interesting. And you know, one aspect of that is also interesting is that Maine in 1820 had a population that was about 10 times larger than the population of Missouri. Maine, because it was such an old territory, right, dating to the 17th century with English-speaking settlers, it actually has a much larger population than we will come to think of it in our 21st century context. So Maine, in a lot of ways, is the prize in this dispute. It's going to have a lot more members of the House of Congress, and Missouri is really a very lightly settled far western territory. So I conceded, yes, it should be the Maine-Missouri Compromise. And then as I did more research about this explosive moment in American political culture, really the first nationwide crisis over the politics of Blackness and the place of slavery in the United States, I discovered there was another aspect of this textbook image that I also thought was really in error. And that's the use of this word compromise. And so to explain that, I've got to move a little deeper into talking about how exactly this crisis came about. So Maine has petitioned the US Congress to be admitted as a state, and it has been permitted to do this by the Massachusetts legislature through a long process that I'll talk about a little bit later. But that petition from Maine, which arrives in December 1819, arrives at a US Congress that has been deadlocked for a year about this question of admitting Missouri as a slave state. Essentially, the House of Representatives has voted to prohibit the admission of Missouri if slavery is a legal institution there, and the US Senate has disagreed and said the national government doesn't have the authority to determine what a state-level law about slavery should look like. So the Main Petition arrives, and right away, one of the US congressmen from Maine writes back to the leading political figure in the independence movement, a guy named William King, who becomes the first governor of Maine. He's a wealthy merchant based in Bath, very prominent figure. And the congressman is writing back to William King, essentially asking for advice, explaining what's going on in Washington, D.C. And this congressman, Mark Langdon Hill from Phippsburg, warns William King of big trouble. He says that, quote, some bargain or compromise will be needed. And Hill's advice was that Maine needed to fall in line and support the interests that favored the expansion of slavery. He wrote in this letter, we should, quote, say nothing opposed to the wishes of the Southern people. And then he adds a PS at the end of his letter, I hope the people of Maine will remain still on the slave question. Now, what's really interesting about this is that William King, who was born and raised in Scarborough with a half-brother named Rufus King, his half-brother Rufus is a Federalist US Senator, and Rufus King is the leader of the opposition to the expansion of slavery to Missouri. So William King is a little bit torn, right? Should he follow his brother's leadership opposing the expansion of slavery? Should he listen to the advice he's getting from the US congressman? And he wavers a little bit, but relatively quickly, William King decides that he wants Maine independence from Massachusetts, irregardless of the moral or ethical questions about the expansion of slavery. So King sides with Hill and one other member of the congressional delegation from Maine to say, we're going to embrace this. We're going to accept working cooperatively with the expansion of slavery in Missouri, and both of us entering as new states in the US. Now, that of course succeeds, and that's how we get the Maine-Missouri quote-unquote compromise. But what is really important to know is that this was a minority opinion among residents in the state of Maine at the time. And what ends up happening, there are actually 7 members of the US Congress from Maine in 1820. Now there's a discontinuity between past and present, right? Maine had such a big population relative to other states in 1820. We have 7 members in the House of Representatives. 5 of them opposed Maine statehood. 5 of them said, if our route to becoming a state is part of this bargain with slavery expanding into Missouri, then we want no part of it. Now, what is extraordinary is that this question about the linkage comes before the US House of Representatives in an extremely controversial, bitter, angry, mean-spirited vote, and it passes the House of Representatives by just 3 votes, 90 to 87. So if those 2 Maine congressmen who favored Maine statehood via the expansion of slavery, if they had voted with their colleagues in the majority to oppose it, that would have not allowed what we now know to be the Maine-Missouri Compromise. And so what, of course, happens when politicians are forced to make really, really difficult decisions on issues that are really, really close, and even 2 votes would change the outcome of it, each side ends up publishing letters in the newspaper to explain to their constituents, here is why I took the stand that I did. And so it's the letter that 4 of the 5 opponents of this linked admission of Maine and Missouri wrote that leads me to now say the other problem with that textbook map is the use of that word compromise. So this letter from 4 of the 5 opponents of Maine statehood and opponents of this linkage wrote in their letter that they took their stand due to a fear of slave power as something that would corrupt Republican government, and that this was, quote, abhorrent to their notions of the rights of man and humanity. They went on, it is a falsehood to call this a compromise. We utterly protest against and refuse to sanction it with our approbation. So I no longer call it the Missouri Compromise. I now call it the Maine-Missouri Crisis, and want to really recognize how narrowly this was resolved in the way that it was. And I think it's a really fascinating counterfactual question. If that line against the expansion of slavery had been drawn more firmly at this first opportunity in 1820, perhaps we would have had a very different trajectory of the extreme expansion of slavery over the next 3 decades, and of course, a civil war with a horrendous loss of American life. So my final thought about this first past-present connection is to just point out the significance of slavery and issues related to people of African descent in American political culture. In 1820, there were very few people of African descent who lived in Maine, yet because it was such a burning issue in the politics of the nation, it was fundamentally linked to Maine statehood. And I think the same could be said about Maine in 2020. We have a relatively small population of people of African descent, yet issues of diversity, issues of recent immigration, and particularly the ongoing legacy of slavery in American society makes these questions one that are really vital for understanding Maine society and culture in the 21st century, just as they were vital to understanding Maine in the statehood era as well. So I want to move on to my second past-present connection. I'll move a little bit more quickly now. That Maine-Missouri crisis gets into the weeds a little bit, but is such a fascinating issue and is, I think, the most famous issue associated with Maine statehood. So it deserves a little extra attention. Now, the second question I want to turn to has to do with the meaning of sovereignty. So Maine is becoming an independent state, right? So there's a new sense that the District of Maine is no longer part of Massachusetts. It has its own legitimacy and political authority and has a sort of autonomy to establish rules in that society. And a really important question that came up at the time and that is still with us today is about what Maine statehood means for Wabanaki sovereignty, right? This is a fundamentally linked question. We cannot think about what does it mean to create a new state, a new political entity with its own sovereign authority, without also considering other sovereignties that pre-exist and are ongoing in this region. And so I really like this map from the Portland Press Herald, which reminds us of the extent of the Wabanaki homeland, and that this stretches across multiple contemporary US states, but it also stretches across the international border. And I think this too is a really profound recognition of ways in which our sort of imagination of the borders of the state of Maine in the present day can distort other really important historical and contemporary issues. So the way that the Wabanaki homeland crosses the boundaries of states and provinces and nations is highlighted in this image. Now, I guess I want to make 2 points about Wabanaki sovereignty before I move on. Again, I'm really happy to come back and talk about this issue more in the discussion period. And I think that as we try to take the measure of the significance of statehood for Wabanaki people, we really should be aware of 2 different dimensions of Wabanaki historical experience. On the one hand, this has some real perils and some real negative consequences. So the era of Maine statehood and the first decades of Maine as an independent state represent an acceleration of colonization, an acceleration of dispossession, and an acceleration of the loss of life of Wabanaki people in their homeland. And those perils should not be understated or forgotten. At the same time, the persistence of not just Wabanaki individuals and families, but also the persistence of Wabanaki sovereign authority is another crucial aspect of the statehood era. And the specific example I want to talk about a little bit more has to do with a very unique feature of the Maine state legislature. So starting in 1823, so this I think is the second, maybe the second meeting of the Maine state legislature, there were recognized non-voting tribal delegates from the Penobscot Nation at the Maine state legislature in 1823. And a similar delegation of non-voting representatives from the Passamaquoddy tribe arrived there in 1842. Now, I think this is without comparison in other US states in this era. I think it is unheard of. Now, again, I'm not saying this is an ideal situation, right? These are non-voting members, so they are not being treated as equal in any way, but there is an acknowledgement of their official capacity, of their sovereignty, of them speaking on behalf of a larger community. And this is, I think, a really important aspect of the statehood era that we should remember and commemorate, right? It acknowledges really a fundamental challenge to what I think is the most pernicious myth of colonization, and that is that Indians are on the way to disappearing, right? They do not disappear, even in the face of extraordinary dispossession and loss of life. That persistence continues and accelerates in the 20th century, so that we are all certainly aware of really pressing issues about Wabanaki sovereignty in 2020 that are connected and a legacy of the persistence and formal political strategy of Wabanaki individuals and nations in the statehood era as well. So I'm going to move on to a third past-present connection. I'm mindful of my clock ticking away, and I do want to move on to discussion. And the third question I want to raise is also one of this geographic space that we see represented on this slide. But I want to remind us that in the statehood era, the very clear state boundaries that we have in our imagination for Maine, and sort of the way most of us, I expect, imagine the map of the United States, with the Maine as sort of the head of this strange animal looking east, that sense of the basic territory of Maine did not exist in the statehood era. So I've got another map to share with you. This is the most detailed map of North America made by British cartographers in the 18th century. And the image we're looking at is of the fourth edition of this map that came out in 1775. And it was the map used by the diplomats who negotiated the end of the American Revolution in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And all of these crazy lines, colored lines that we see on this map, indicate where different diplomats thought the boundary between the new United States and the persisting provinces of British North America should be drawn. And the long and short of this is, it's a total mess, right? There's language in the treaty that makes specific reference to where the boundary will be, but the meaning of that language on the ground was a complete fantasy, right? It names a river, no one's sure what river it is. It talks about the highlands, nobody agrees what those highlands are. And so this question of Maine's northern border is, of course, not settled, as most Maine-educated people know, until the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. So it takes 2 decades after Maine is a state for a sense of where that national boundary is, or where the extent of Maine is, to finally be established. Now, I've got a favorite example to sort of give a little bit of detail to this question of where is the international border and what does this mean for regional diversity in the state of Maine. And this comes from the 1820 census of the United States. So I was looking up to see, well, what are sort of the statistics for Maine in 1820, and where are the big cities, and how does this all get divvied up? Penobscot County had just been created prior to statehood, so it is getting counted in the 1820 census in a new sort of way. And the 3 largest towns in Penobscot County in 1820 were Hamden at 1,450 people, Bangor at 1,200 people, and the 3rd largest town was Madawaska at 1,100 people. So a very sizable community for the Penobscot County of its day. And Madawaska, in the printed US Census record, has a little asterisk next to it. And you look at the bottom of that page of the census, and here is what the entry says. This French settlement near Canada is about 200 miles from any town in Maine, from which there is no way to get here. So there's a classic Mainism, right? You can't get there from here. The only way is very circuitous up the River St. John. The French who live in Madawaska have supposed they were in Canada, but it is probable the county line, when run, will divide Madawaska between Penobscot and Washington counties. So I love this little example, both for its humor, but more profoundly for the way in which it reminds us of the place of residence in the St. John Valley having a very distinctive relationship to statehood, right? For those French speakers who lived along the St. John River in communities that had been founded by French speakers, at least in the 1780s, the statehood movement does not include them. They are not voting on these statehood questions. They do not speak English for the most part. Their commercial connections are down the river to Fredericton and St. John and up the river to Quebec, right? There's no easy commerce. And that reality of the 1820s is also still with us in the 2020s. When I went to give a talk about the statehood era in Madawaska, the sense of distance and isolation from Augusta was palpable. And the sort of anecdote I often tell is a bunch of people, when I was at that talk, thanked me from coming all the way from Bangor in southern Maine. You know, and that, of course, is sort of funny to people who live in Bangor who do not think about themselves as being from southern Maine. And so I think what this raises that's important is something I'll turn to in my final past-present connection. And that is that the sort of easy projection of Maine as having two Maines, of being divided in two, is really too simplistic, both in our contemporary moment and in our historical one. There is more diversity and a greater range of opinion and disagreement than to simply break things down in a polarized two Maine sort of vision of who we are. So let me try to wrap up before my time completely expires by just mentioning again issues of partisan anger as something that was very central to the statehood process. And I've talked about that on the national level as part of the Maine, Missouri crisis that could not have been more angry and terrible at the national level. But the question of becoming independent from Massachusetts was also a very bitter argument at the state level, or I guess I should call it at the district level in Maine, over the course of many decades. And this map just gives us a little snapshot of the 6 moments when voters in Maine were permitted by the Massachusetts legislature to cast their opinion about this question. Do you favor separation from Maine, from Massachusetts, or do you oppose separation? So the purple areas on this map show county level voting data of where people lived who supported, purple is in favor of becoming an independent state of Maine. So obviously in 1819, it's become a majority issue. The 1819 vote as a result is not really that interesting to me. What is interesting is the basic evidence here that we do not get a map that becomes a little bit more green, a little bit more green, a little bit, say that again, other way around, a little more purple with each successive vote, right? This is a jagged and contested issue. And we can see the low point comes in 1807 when only a single county had a majority of voters in favor of becoming an independent state. So I think this is really a puzzle for us in 2020, right? Most Maine people today understand that there's a certain animosity toward people from Massachusetts. And we would think if Mainers are given the opportunity to separate from Massachusetts, they would do that in a heartbeat. But that is not true to the historical experience of how the statehood process unfolded. So again, here is a map that I could talk about in a whole lot more detail, but I am gonna save that if anyone wants to dig into some of the idiosyncrasies of the statehood votes and how they changed over time. I'd love to talk about that in the discussion section. Let me just leave you with one final map, and this is my favorite image of the statehood era, because this county level voting map is also problematic, right? As we've already discussed, the counties do not run to the far northern border of what we now think of the state of Maine. There are no voters living very far from the coast at all. And so this historical map from 1829 really does place us more accurately in the statehood era. This wonderful cartographer, Moses Greenleaf, made this interpretive map in 1829 to show where English-speaking people lived in the state of Maine. And he added to this these three bands of color. So blue represents where people lived at the time, where English speakers lived at the time of the American Revolution. Pink represents the expansion of English settlement by the time of Jefferson's election in 1800. And yellow represents those newly settled areas by statehood in 1820. So again, we really get a sense here of just how distant that community of Madawaska was way up on the St. John River. It might have had the third largest settlement size in Penobscot County in 1820, but it was not connected in many ways at all with the English-speaking majority that remains primarily along the coast and in the southwestern corner of the state of Maine. So with that, I'm going to take a big sip of water and hope that John has some chat questions for me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Well, thanks so much, Liam. That was terrific, fascinating, and I assume, I know we've got questions to get to. And just a reminder to everybody, if you want to ask a question of Professor Riordan, just go to the chat button at the bottom of your screen and type in your question, and we will get to them. One I wanted to ask you while you finish off that drink of water, in looking at the map of where the support or opposition was, the series of maps you showed over the course of those, thank you, those 6 separation votes, I noticed that there seems to be, up until the last vote, a consistent concentration of opposition along the coast, especially mid-coast and upward. Could you explain why opposition existed there?
So this is a sort of application of that two Maine's thesis to the statehood era. And a lot has been written about this, that there was a tendency for coastal settlements to favor remaining part of Massachusetts, and more newly settled interior places tended to be leaders of the Maine independence movement. And that vision is an interesting one because it's not just geographic, it also maps onto economic status, right? The older communities on the coast tend to be wealthier. They also tend to obviously be more aligned with commerce and trade. So a lot of merchants in coastal towns and laborers who worked on ships and shipbuilders had reasons for wanting to stay in Massachusetts, not the least of which was a federal law that protected interstate commerce by water from taxes if you sailed to a state that you were adjacent to. Now, the funny thing about Massachusetts geography is that you could sail all the way to New Jersey before you got to a state that Massachusetts was not adjacent to. So for anyone involved in maritime commerce, to separate from Massachusetts while that law was in effect had potentially devastating consequences for your economic livelihood. So that's one of the reasons we get the landslide vote in 1819. The federal coasting law is changed, and this powerful argument against statehood is really taken away just before the 1819 vote. But the two Maine's thesis still holds. There's the geographic issue, there are the economic issues. There's also a political issue that the coastal settlements are mostly federalists and the interior settlements are mostly Democratic Republicans. This state independence movement is a super, super partisan issue. Massachusetts has a long federalist control of state politics that is unique in the US. After the election of Jefferson in 1800, you relatively rapidly are getting strong Democratic Republican majorities almost everywhere. And the District of Maine was part of that trend. There are many more Democratic Republicans. There's a clear Democratic Republican majority in Maine by about 1805. So partisanship is really shaping this. But then the final thing about that coastal interior difference is, I think, perhaps the most interesting. And that is the way that religion played a role in the statehood movement. So older settlements on the coast had many more congregational churches. And these newer settlers who are coming to interior areas, who are more Democratic Republican, who are poorer, are also more evangelical, more Baptist and Methodist. Well, Massachusetts state law until 1830 gave special economic status to congregational churches. And it's kind of shocking to us, right? It doesn't seem right, but the separation of church and state in the US Constitution is about the national government. It doesn't have anything to do with the rules about state government. And one of the legacies of the Puritan origins of Massachusetts is that it gave the congregational church special tax-supported status. So Methodists and Baptists, other non-congregationalists, had real reasons for opposing remaining in Massachusetts because their tax dollars went to support a congregational minister, even if that was not their particular faith. So there is this two Maines cleavage that is significant, and we really see it most clearly in the contrast between Lincoln and Kennebec County, right? Kennebec County is the only county in favor of separation in 1807. And if we look in 1816, we can see Lincoln County in bright green, Kennebec opposed. That's where the cleavage is sharpest. When we actually get down into down East Maine, we see strong opposition to independence. So it's not quite as stark as all coast and all interior. But it is a fascinating question. And then you really have to get into the micro level town data to play it out about how that works. William King, who I've mentioned, was the great leader of the independence movement. He was from Bath, which is a big settlement in that era, but Bath is consistently in favor of independence. So large cities with large laboring populations, they tend to be Democratic Republican, they tend to support independence. So as interesting as that two Maines cleavage is in the statehood era, I think when we really press the data, we see it breaks down in a whole lot of different ways.
No, thank you for that. Good question that came in says, if one accepts the premise that Maine statehood was inevitable, had the statehood attempt in 1820 been voted down, how much longer do you feel we may have remained as part of Massachusetts?
That's a great question. And I do think it opens up that whole what if sort of issue. What if the Maine, Missouri crisis had been resolved in a different way? You know, I think by 1820, Maine was going to become independent. There was nothing really very urgent about agreeing to this quote unquote compromise in 1820. And I say that in particular because of that partisan issue where Federalists had retained quite a bit of influence in Massachusetts state government, but the District of Maine was very strongly Democratic Republican. And so by 1820, you actually have a lot of Federalists in Massachusetts who would like to get rid of the District of Maine, right? They are going to be safer if they can cut their ties and let Maine go off on its own, right? Only because of Democratic Republican majorities in Maine are Massachusetts Federalists really imperiled in statewide votes. So I think Maine statehood would have happened quite quickly, and we would not have had to be part of fueling the expansion of slavery into Missouri and other Western areas.
Thank you. A related question of the representatives who were opposed to statehood, what happened to them after in the next election?
That's a great question. So there are very few Northern members of the House of Representatives who vote in favor of the expansion of slavery to Missouri. And the label that they were given at the time was Doe Faces, right? This is kind of an insulting term, right? They're soft, they're not taking a strong stand, they're caving in because of larger political interests. And it has to do with the national strength of the Democratic Republican Party has, of course, really been in Virginia. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, these are the leaders of the Democratic Republican Party. And so the two congressmen from Maine, Mark Langdon Hill from Phippsburg, who I've already mentioned, and John Holmes from Alfred, these two were not just in the minority in Maine, but in a very small majority among Northern members of the House of Representatives who supported the expansion of slavery. Overwhelmingly, those Doe Faces lose in their reelection bids, but this is not true of Mark Langdon Hill and John Holmes. That I think because of strong Democratic Republican majorities in Maine, they, in fact, Holmes, I think Holmes does not stand for re-election as a member of the House. He gets, I think, appointed to become a US Senator because now Maine has 2 new seats, right? So he doesn't, but then he does win re-election as a US Senator. So their political careers are not sidetracked the way that many other Doe Faces did have their electoral success challenged.
Interesting. Excuse me, a question was, what was the population of Maine in 1820, and did people from Massachusetts, the southern part of Massachusetts, I guess you would say, migrate to Maine, to the District of Maine for economic or political reasons?
So that's a great question. I don't have my right notes printed out. I can't give you chapter and verse about the population in 1820. I should have that as part of my standard notes, but I don't. The basics of, we can count the population in Maine very clearly thanks to the US Census starting in 1790. So we've got these very clear benchmarks. And the growth of the population of first the district and then the state of Maine is incredible. It is growing by leaps and bounds every single decade. And This is really significant to the dispossession of Wabanaki people, right? The Maine has been, as we saw in that map of 1829, Maine is very lightly settled along the coast in the southeast. And we can just get a sense of the tempo of that expansion in each of these colored bands. That population expansion comes to an end between the censuses of 1860 and 1870. That Civil War decade is really a turning point in Maine history in really important ways. So those first decades of Maine statehood are when the economy is as robust as it will ever be, the heyday of shipbuilding and trade, population is booming. That is disrupted during the Civil War era, in part, obviously, because of the deaths of young men in the Civil War from Maine, but also because that experience of going elsewhere in the country and the opening with the railroads to the mid and far west really began a period that we're familiar with up to the present of a outmigration of young people from Maine. The last thing I'll say about that growing population in the first 2/3 of the 19th century is that it is overwhelmingly migration from southern New England. So we've got overcrowded settlements in southern New England, and they are moving to try to take advantage of agricultural land in Maine, particularly east of the Kennebec. And that gets disrupted too by the limits of agriculture, given the soil and the climate as you move further east in Maine.
Were there land grants or other forms of incentives to get people to relocate to Maine?
So it's a really fascinating and complicated question. There is the persistence of enormous land holdings that are concentrated in the hands of just a few individuals. And so William Bingham is the name most associated with this. He was one of the wealthiest Americans of the early 19th century, well, really the late 18th century. And he acquires huge amounts of territory, both in the Kennebec patent and also much of Maine east of the Penobscot River. And he is a land speculator hoping to develop this and bring settlers there. And his daughter marries Lord Ashburton, who is the man who is associated with the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842. So there's a whole domestic and landholding side to that diplomatic moment that establishes the border between Maine, the US, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Canada that connects back to the large-scale landholding of William Bingham that his daughter inherited, and then that Lord Ashburton has a financial interest in as well in the 1840s.
Wow. Question about the Maine, Missouri crisis that you mentioned. How is the so-called Missouri Compromise handled now in contemporary high school texts, not looking at scholarly work so much as what is part of the general education curriculum that we have in school now? Is it more, is it less fuzzy, less weighted, less mythical than it was, say, when you and I were growing up?
I don't think so, is the short answer. It's such a complicated question, and there are a number of wrinkles to it that are pretty hard to tease out, and that I've glossed over as well in my presentation. So Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's a representative from Kentucky. It's a neighboring state to Missouri, very similar kind of politics, very similar border state with slavery as legal. So Clay is very much in favor of the expansion of slavery into Missouri. And he, is a master parliamentarian, and he puts together, it's not just one, there's one key vote that I cite the narrowness of the outcome, but there's actually 4 or 5 different bills that are all interconnected. And, just to really be able to explain what Clay is up to and how this sausage gets made is really pretty elaborate. And I'll just say one element of the crisis that extends, past Maine statehood into 1821 has to do with Missouri's state constitution, right? Obviously, when you file your petition for statehood, you've got your proposed state constitution as part of that. And the Missouri state constitution of 1821 has some very reprehensible elements in it, and ones that most people, I think, agree are in violation of the US Constitution. And so the Missouri State Constitution of 1821 prohibited free African American citizens of other states from migrating to Missouri. So this extends this crisis, and the anti-slavery forces in Congress are mobilizing again to say, this is against the US Constitution. This cannot be permitted. But again, Clay is able to take advantage of his political acumen to make sure that the deal gets done. I reached out to a bunch of historians in Missouri and to the Missouri Historical Society about ways in which we might do 2-state bicentennial commemorative activity. And the differences in commemorating statehood between Maine and Missouri in 2020 could hardly be more stark. In the wake of Ferguson, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, Missouri statehood is really a painful, readily felt sore in Missouri in ways that it isn't in Maine. So it remains, I think, this is, I think, one of the real challenges of history education is the amount of detail, the amount of context. It is difficult to pick what are the priorities in terms of what should be part of an appropriate civics education for K through 12 students.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, too, for your presentation. Professor Riordan talked about the Wabanaki peoples, and I want everybody to know before we wrap up today that our next alumni webinar is going to deal with the Wabanaki peoples. This will be on October 8th, and let me just give you a quick overview. It's called First Persons, Maine's Wabanaki Peoples, and it will feature a panel of representatives of the Penobscot Nation and Passamaquoddy tribe, and they'll share their perspectives on the history of Maine's First Peoples, as well as the public policy, social, and cultural issues that Native Americans continue to address. And that, of course, includes the issue of Wabanaki sovereignty. This will be moderated by a UMaine alum, prominent UMaine alum, Donna Loring, who currently is a special advisor to Governor Mills, but also served in that role that Professor Riordan mentioned as a member of the legislature. She represented Penobscot Nation as a non-voting member of the legislature. She has a variety of other titles and that give her a great perspective on some of the issues that we talked about today. So that will be October 8th. And so we'll be sending out everybody a notice about that as well. So Dr. Riordan, thank you again for your time. And to everybody, please stay healthy and well. And again, take care of yourselves, and thanks for staying in touch with us. Be well.
Thank you all for coming today.